We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. I had a really interesting conversation recently with Mark Feasel. I like talking to Mark a lot. He always seems to have a unique and deeply thoughtful perspective on the issues of the day that are affecting the electric power grid. Many of you know him from his years in leadership at Schneider Electric and FuelCell Energy. He recently launched a consulting service, and he's thinking a lot about the big changes ahead for energy being brought on by AI. He sees data centers facing a kind of blank slate. The old approach of just going to the utility for power often doesn't work anymore. And this situation presents some interesting opportunities. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I know I did. Mark Feasel, it is so great to have you here today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. We've been talking for years, and every discussion we've had has always left me walking away thinking about new things.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be here with you today.
You've been up to so many things over the last several years, and you've got a keen eye on the distributed energy market. Going back to you and I first started talking way back when you were working in microgrids at Schneider Electric. So you've always had this real eye for this market, and I'm really curious what your take is these days on what's happening here. What are the problems, and what are some of the ways DERs can help solve them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been quite the journey since we met almost 10 years ago, I think. Even thinking back to then in this kind of arc we've been on, there's been some pretty profound changes. As I think about that time period, we saw a world in which consumers were beginning to become situationally aware. Digital technology was allowing them to understand this commodity of energy or electricity better. And they could start to make choices around, was it green enough for me? Was it resilient enough for me? Is the cost as predictable or as low as I want? And so certainly we were beginning to see people embrace this idea of distributed energy. And in fact, that was resulting in a scenario where I remember terminologies like utility death spiral, where, in the 2016, 17, 18, utilities were really thinking about this world in which never-ending load growth was going to end, because essentially some of that growth being picked up in this distributed fashion. And of course, you may remember that some of the initial projects that we had done around microgrid, like the Montgomery County microgrid, were actually working with utilities to try to understand how they could capture load in new ways. And as I think back to that world and how different it is today, because no longer are we talking about lack of utility load growth, right? We're talking about a world now in which we don't know where we're going to get all of the capacity that we need to serve this new kind of load. Going back to that time period, we talked about decommoditizing electricity on kind of four main vectors. One is sustainability. How sustainable is it? Is it what I need? We talked about resilience. Is it there when I need it? We talked about cost predictability. But the fourth thing we talked about was access. Do I have access to the grid? And back in 2017, we weren't talking about North America. We weren't talking about developed economies. We were talking about Southeast Asia and Africa and other places where billions of people existed without access to the grid or very good grid. But that access variable, that's the variable that's new in these mature markets today, including in North America. I think we began to see it with the growth of the electric vehicle. That was maybe one of the first incremental loads that looked promising. But where it's really accelerated over the last, let's say, 24 months, is that the compute needs, maybe at first are preceding a little bit cryptocurrency, but certainly now AI data center. Data center have been growing for quite a long time, but the load growth or forecasted load growth of AI is something that really has people thinking about, where am I going to get this grid? So as we look at these new kinds of loads in the US, it's really about access to energy in addition to that sustainability, resilience, and cost.
It's just a whole completely new world. Back 10 years ago, DERs were a competition to utilities, really, because there was, as you said, there was no load growth. There was limited demand. The demand was flat. And now suddenly it puts everybody in a whole different place, because now it seems to me anyway, DERs are no longer so much a competitor anymore. They're like another resource that utilities and everybody else needs.
That's exactly right. I think that a lot of utilities are getting a lot of questions today. They've got people that are interested in setting up new load, which, of course, I think for most of the life would have been a great story to go hear that. But of course, today it's like, wow, how am I really going to go serve this load? How do I think about that? And, one of the things, if you look at access to the grid today, what that represents to a lot of these data centers and new load growth customers is what I might say is like oceanfront property, right? So where do I have a spot where today I can get access to the grid? It's something that most people understand, how to get electricity from a power grid. When you do that, you don't have to worry about maybe where the generator's at or what kind of generator it is, or do I need storage, yes or no, or all these, how am I going to finance it? The utility has always been, in a way, the easy button for a consumer to go and get their needs met with respect to powering whatever their industry is. So still today, I believe that oceanfront property, people are really trying to find out where it's at. But at the same time, now we're seeing that it simply isn't there. That oceanfront property is indeed kind of running out. And then the question becomes, where does that shift to?
They can't connect to the grid. It's difficult to connect to the grid. The wait lines are incredible in some places. So what do they do? So you're a data center, you need power. Say you want renewable energy, is going to be delay in that project being built and connecting to the grid so that you can access it. Where does that leave these kind of companies that have demand, and the demand is coming up really fast? We often talk in energy about what's going to happen in 10 years or even 20 years. But this time, with this data center and AI demand, it's coming up pretty quickly.
I think you're exactly right. And especially in the AI realm, where this to me harkens back to the time of the search engine wars. And I think many of us that's been around a while remember using Alta Vista and Yahoo as our primary search engines. Then all of a sudden this Google pops up and the results are better and there's not as many ads. And, all of a sudden, I don't know about you, but I don't think you probably search with Alta Vista anymore. There was clear winners and losers out of that competition happening. I think that the general consensus is that this same thing could happen with these various AI chatbot type applications, that not everyone will win. There will be winners, there will be losers. The people that win are probably the organizations that can get the training done now, that can deliver the best results when people really start to query. Now, I'm sure, Lisa, like me, you probably already are embracing AI. There's certainly a lot of people, a lot of us that are, but there's a whole lot of us that aren't as well. And all of us will be using it much more holistically in the future than we are now. And I've seen a lot of forecasts around what energy demand is going to look like and even what it is today. And what, of course, is probably not a big surprise to you is that nearly all of the energy consumption is on training right now. It's not actually on fulfilling those queries. But if you move forward in the future, 5-6 years from now, most of that compute is on maybe fulfilling those queries and not so much on training. And of course, if you've got the best models, you deliver the best results, you're likely going to go win that. So I think that you've got a lot of people right now thinking about, how do I get that compute in the ground right now and happening so I'm ready? And they've got to answer new questions than maybe they've had to answer in the past. I think for most of history, a data center could say, okay, great, I've got the grid. And what do I need to add on to the grid to make it fit my need? And clearly, one of the things that most data centers knew they had to do was they had to upscale the resilience of the grid. Throughout most of the US, the grid is around 99.7% available, which sounds great, but it also does mean that you're out almost 8 hours a year. If you're at 99.9%, you are out 8 hours a year.
That's a lot.
And so data centers have had to think about, okay, that's the best I'm going to get. I'm not going to go tell the utility to do a lot more than that. So how do I rethink this? And so they thought about, okay, well, I need these things called power distribution units with smart controls for multiple buses. They thought about UPSs. They think about all kind of sophisticated load management and automatic transfer schemes. And they've adopted essentially an entire way of working that is prefaced upon interfacing with the grid. But what if that grid's not there, right? You're starting from a whole different place. You're starting from a blank canvas versus connecting to this known entity. And that, quite frankly, is creating a lot of questions. What can I depend upon? What kind of distributed energy resources can deliver these kind of outcomes to me? And it's leading into a world in which you've got to solve for all of those four vectors I talked about almost from a blank slate. So do I need it now? And if so, what can I get now? That's a big question, right? I mean, ever since COVID, we've been hearing about extended supply chains, difficulty getting some components. So what does that look like? And then, of course, you go back to those three things around, how green do I need this to be? What are the commitments that I've made to my shareholders or my employees or my customers around how I'm running that? Resilience. I mean, how fault tolerant do I need to be? What kind of services am I providing? Are people depending upon me in their times of need? And if so, how do I make sure I'm there for them? And finally, cost, right? Energy cost is one of the largest variables to the business model of data centers. And if you can't solve for that or get that in the right spot, you're going to have difficulty running a profitable business. So this creates a new world in which utilities are really having to rethink that from a blank sheet.
And the data centers are really rethinking it too, right? I keep hearing more and more about these data centers that are choosing to go with all on-site power, and maybe the utility is kind of backup or even perhaps not there. I just recently read about a project in Texas where they are basically developing data centers with all completely on-site power, not grid connected. So that fascinates me because these data centers these are large companies, right? These are some of the wealthiest companies in the world that are developing some of these data centers, and they could really reshape the way electric power is used. They could have massive influence. Somewhere I saw a figure that said that, I forgot by what date, maybe it was 2035, something like that data centers could represent 12% of demand in the US. And what hit me right away was, my God, that is one powerful constituency that can really influence like what kind of power is used.
You're exactly right. For the last 100 years, generation of power was centralized and generally done in a place that was unobtrusive and out of the way of everyone else, right? We've all seen the big, huge power plants along rivers or out in the middle of nowhere. And then, of course, build a lot of transmission distribution lines to get where it needed to be. But we're talking about now power generation, to your point, that's being built from the load out. And it's going to have some major implications. I mean, you're going to put large amounts of power generation now that might be very close to urban centers. And to your point, these are massive loads. You're hearing about hundreds of megawatts being deployed. I mean, these loads represent what would have been city-sized loads in the past. And now the industry is really looking at serving those loads locally. And that brings with it some new considerations. So I'm now having people that might live very close to this. Let's think about a scenario where a data center is serving up some amazing content to people all around the world and people benefit from that data. Absolutely. Maybe the folks that live around the data center don't necessarily benefit from that data as much, right? Instead, are they exposed to whatever ramifications that all this new power generation is going to bring? And how does someone think about, in a very kind of thoughtful, responsible way, serving this load? And to your point, maybe creating these new energy oases that will potentially serve as the cornerstone of the grid of the future versus the grid of the past.
Yeah, I live in Virginia, so I know all about people not liking data centers. We hear about that a lot here. So I have to ask you, I'm so curious what you think about this. I'm hearing two things. Some people are saying to me, we see a real rise in distributed energy, on-site energy, self-generation, non-utility kind of approaches for these data centers. They see the data centers as sort of the thing that's going to really push this industry forward. And then I've talked to other folks who think what's actually going to change is that the utilities will start providing distributed energy in a big way because they're going to realize that this is what we can build. This is what we can get out there for these folks. I'm just curious where you may come down on those two worlds.
Well, I think the answer is definitely yes to both. Look, there's some real important considerations. I mean, let's start with the utilities, right? They're companies that, for in some cases, a century, they've mastered the construction, operation, maintenance of energy assets. They have the equipment and the training to do this safely, and they know how to serve customers. They've got agreements in place when storms and bad things happen to help each other. Why wouldn't these organizations with all these skills not be major players if you're talking about a major build out of energy infrastructure? But at the same time, the largest of these entities, the investor-owned utilities, are shepherds of the public's assets. And the public, through the rate base, through their bills they pay every month, has built a lot of this infrastructure. And when new infrastructure goes in to accommodate these new loads, is it fair that the people of Virginia or the people of somewhere else around these are picking up some kind of incremental costs associated with these new loads? Or in some ways, are these new loads coming on benefiting from the investments that have been paid for by ratepayers? And so this is a thing that I think that a lot of utility regulatory bodies are really struggling with. And believe me, right now, the cost of energy is the number one conversation at public utility commissions. Across the US, energy price has risen significantly over the last several years. And it's generally the first thing that's talked about. I was part of a panel about a month ago that was talking about resource adequacy in New Jersey, actually in the PJM area. And we were talking about, hey, how are we going to think about keeping this grid reliable? And we had a lot of regulators on the call. But underpinning the whole thing was we can't raise the rates, right? We're already making people choose difficult decisions around how they're going to pay for their energy bill. And so that's the very difficult thing that the utilities are going to have to face. So how can they step into this? They leverage this great experience and background they have, but do so in a way that a data center company isn't riding on the backs of the normal people that have to go pay their bill every month and are just worried about, can I pay my bill or pay for my prescription medicine this month? So that's a real challenge that has to be worked through. And honestly, there's not real easy answers to that. It requires a lot of thought and careful diligence.
We had a live stream about a month ago with Ari Pesco from Harvard, who did a study on how data center costs can get masked in a utility rate proceeding. And not to impugn that anybody's trying to do anything unethical, but the point is it's such a complex system. Regulation is so complex around utilities. And when you hear this kind of story from the outside, you might think, oh, well, just make sure the data centers pay their share. Like it's very simple to just untangle where the transmission costs are going and all these different expenses are being allocated and used. And it's just not. It's not simple. It's not a simple question at all.
It's exceedingly difficult. If you look at how a lot of utility bills are constructed, they include things like your peak demand. In some cases, it's you pay a percentage of the coincident peak demand, which is the peak demand that occurs whether or not you were part of it or not for the rest of the grid. There's things like power factor penalties and time of use. And the truth is that these costs get bundled up into all of these different vectors. And to your point, it is exceedingly difficult to, quote unquote, make someone pay their fair share, right? That's a topic, I think, of potential big debate, which really kind of the other half of the both of how we started the conversation, which is that's where I really do see, in addition to utilities finding ways to thoughtfully engage and use this great expertise, certainly the rise of the kind of the private markets, distributed generation solutions, whether it's energy as a service companies or non-regulated utility operations or other distributed business models, really having to rise because they probably can do it at a little faster pace. They don't have to go through public service commissions. They can move quickly in some cases, meet these needs right away when they need to be met. Certainly see the rise of private industry doing this in addition to utilities playing a major role in the future.
You've been on the private side for a long time. How do you think about the cost of private versus utility? My question is actually, is it hard to raise inexpensive money to build distributed energy privately? And could the utilities, assuming they can get the rate approvals, could they do it less expensively?
There's a few different vectors to that. One vector is certainly the quality of the off-taker. So a utility can think about a large portfolio of off-takers, right? Industry, residential, institutional, et cetera. And there's kind of a natural hedge that can, the law of large numbers, risk is divided up quite a bit. And you can attract some pretty relatively low cost capital in that kind of business model. So when you've got a single off-taker, then the interest of the financial communities will be tied just to that one off-taker, which if that off-taker is investment grade, then the cost of capital can be quite low in that scenario. On the other hand, if it's a less known entity or maybe a newer industry like cryptocurrency, those represent risks that will probably be priced into what you're going to have to borrow money at in order to build these things. But there's also some other things. So another thing is, historically, when utilities have thought about raising money to build energy infrastructures, they think about time horizons that are measured in decades, right? 20 years, 30. Some of these nuclear plants are, 50 and 70 years economic useful lives, whatever they're tied to. When people are looking at the challenge today, are they going to be willing to or able to sign up for a 20-year commitment? Or instead, are people saying, look, we know we want to proceed now. There's certainly 10 years. Let's go ahead and price this around a 10-year term. What that does is whatever your capital costs are, they essentially have to be spread over a much shorter time period that results in a higher levelized cost of energy to the consumer. There's even shorter windows than that people are talking about right now, which is kind of this bridge, right? Bridge to utility, bridge to grid strategy, where a lot of people are looking at the world and they're thinking, okay, I'm hearing about these time to power challenges. I'm hearing about these long interconnection queues. Why don't I go and just think about something that might be 5 years? This is where the disconnect happens. If I'm a data center or even if I'm a factory, it's a lot easier for me to commit to a contract that's 5 years in length. My business planning is relatively in that time period. Versus on the other side of the spectrum, you really can only compete with grid rates generally when you're talking about long time horizons, these 10, 15, 20-year type horizons. So this is a conflict that's occurring right now that you've kind of got this disconnect on. People want 5 years, but they're comparing it to energy research from 10 year, 20 years that kind of aren't here today. So interesting conundrum we're in.
Yeah, that is a very interesting conundrum. And I suppose another sort of angle on that is I'm hearing of some companies that are going with on-site energy for the short term, assuming that they will eventually connect, but they just can't connect right away.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing I've seen directly getting traction now is the theory that, okay, let's call it bridge to grid. And I could take an energy resource, let's say a gas engine, that maybe in the long term, I would want to do something else, maybe not. And maybe the grid will come at some point and it'll be cheaper or greener or something than this. But the idea is that these assets I bought can then become the backup for when the grid's there. And that's one way to kind of wrap their mind around, okay, I can go ahead and pay a little more. I'm going to go ahead and do a 5-year contract. Yes, I'm paying more than the grid would have been that I can't get now. But now I'm not going to have to go out and buy all these engines when the grid's actually here for my backup. So there's some thoughts around how do you think about the back end of these financial contracts and how do you use these assets?
Interesting. We're coming up on our time, but there's 2 more questions I want to ask you. First question is, what technology, business model, project type, what is out there right now that you're excited about?
Wow. I think right now it's really trying to think, what are the all-in strategies around energy? There's some interesting things that are happening in the space of even utilizing assets that I'm not saying we've written off, but maybe to some extent like coal. And so I don't necessarily mean, hey, let's burn coal to go serve this load, although in some cases that is happening today. But is there ways in which we can use gas that had been escaping from these coal mines and be able to use that to fulfill some of this. This is something I'm hearing quite a bit now, the ability to capture that methane that would be escaping from those. So it represents a way to use an older fossil fuel and at the same time take advantage of the power that what would have been wasted or flared gas can bring you. So there's a lot of interest around that. Other things I've seen on the coal as well is the able to go and leverage that coal through pyrolysis or other mechanisms that allow you to extract energy without combustion. And so, I've been following some of those, seeing quite a bit of interest, especially in the center of the US around those kinds of trends. The other thing that's happening in the world today is, how do you go and deliver modular, scalable solutions? One of the challenges is people forecast all this growth, but it can be difficult to know exactly when they need it. So how can solutions be delivered in bite-sized amounts? And when I think about a data center, it's not just power, but data centers need a lot of cooling as well. And often they faced a bit of a conundrum like, okay, I think I'm going to need 100 megawatts of power and then X amount of cooling. Well, it requires a lot of infrastructure to deliver that. And maybe they don't actually have line of sight to all that, computer processing power they need right now to fill out that entire 100 megawatts. So how do you think about delivering something that can scale? Can you scale power and cooling at the same time? That I think is kind of an interesting field that, I've seen a lot of activity in and I'm kind of digging into myself. How do we think about delivering in a modular, scalable, repeatable way?
Are you referring to like combined heat and power or district energy?
Yeah, it does involve some of that. So it can involve, for example, being able to use the waste heat from a combined heat and power plant. Data centers need two things, right? They need power and they need cooling. And it so happens that with a combined heat and power plant, a lot of time, if in a lot of worlds, the heat is not captured or used from a generator because the generators are out in the field somewhere. But to your point, we talked about earlier on, if we're actually going to co-locate the energy source and the load, all of a sudden it's not so hard to do something with that heat. I can use absorption chilling in order to create cold water that can cool down these data centers. Or even if I can't use that, I might be able to use like an organic Rankine cycle turbine to create a little more energy. So when you are co-locating supply and demand, there's ways to use what would have been wasted energy to make the most of that molecule.
Very interesting. So my last question to you is, I know you teach at Northwestern, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what you teach and also what are you learning from your students?
Wow, great question, Lisa. It has been a great learning journey for me at Northwestern. It's been 6 years, just an incredible journey. Northwestern established a master's degree program in energy and sustainability. And what I love about it is that it is a kind of interdisciplinary, that you get students that come out of business school, they come out of engineering undergrads, they're future lawyers, future CFOs, future engineers, but they all have in their heart a real desire to make a difference in this world. And this energy and sustainability story really has lit a fire in this generation that's just graduating from school right now. And so they see this world in front of them and they believe that they can leverage their business or engineering or financial backgrounds to help. And the class that I teach really begins, first of all, with these different types of students that together we talk about this world as we transition from fossil fuels and we begin to embrace alternative energy. What are the technical, business, and policy issues that together we need to go solve? And so I think this program is just outstanding for these students. I'll tell you what's been really interesting to me is that in 2019, the first year, these students had in their undergraduate degrees literally no exposure to energy and sustainability. Yes, the mechanical and electrical engineers could tell you about Rankine cycles and things like this. But for the most part, the other folks hadn't heard much. And even the engineering students were super focused in a single domain. And so I was really sharing with them, this was their first real exposure. Let me tell you, by last year's class, 2024 class, there is a lot of information that is already flowing into the undergraduate curriculums. So when they come into my class at the master's level, it is no longer me answering simple questions and kind of introducing them. And we're now beginning, instead of a 101 or 201 class, we're beginning like a 401 level of class in terms of energy. So It will keep you on your toes, absolutely. And because there's so much in the news today, whether it's what happened in Spain or whether it's, Texas or California or public safety shutoffs or the growth of AI load, these things are front and center, and they're going to be a topic of conversation, and you're going to be debating them with some really inspired and smart people. So I have really enjoyed that.
That's wonderful. That's very inspiring to hear that things are changing that quickly and the curriculum is changing and there's so much more awareness now as they enter into the graduate program. That's really cool. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Every time I talk to you, I absolutely learn new things. You always have this sort of cutting edge thinking going on. So I appreciate you being here on our show today and look forward to always the next time we talk.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been an honor spending this time with you today.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.